Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Bible, one book, one verse at a time. Today we're picking up with the book of 2 Corinthians. Now this book is listed as the second letter to the Corinthians in our collection of books in the New Testament, but it's actually the third or maybe even the fourth letter he wrote them. See, after Paul planted the church and then moved on to plant other churches in other communities, he heard a report that things were not going well in Corinth. Then he wrote a letter to them to help correct some of the bad things he was hearing. And this is the letter that we probably call 1 Corinthians. It seems, though, that letter wasn't all that well accepted, and people started to call into question Paul's credentials. And after the people called into question Paul's credentials, they then said, so because he doesn't have the credentials we think he needs to have, we don't have to listen to him. And they started to ignore his instructions and to continue down these paths that Paul had said were wrong, which we saw from 1 Corinthians were quite wrong. But in the middle of this, then Paul decides to come and make a visit he calls a painful visit in the letter that we have to the 2 Corinthians, or the 2 Corinthians letter. And then he also said that he wrote a painful letter in the meantime. And in that visit and in that letter where he confronts people and calls into question what they are actually doing, the people seem to recognize that what they had done was wrong. There's this sense of repentance and of moving forward in a new direction. And so then when Paul hears that, then he sends what we have as the second letter to the Corinthians. And this letter is full of renewal, of reconnection, and of also Paul addressing some of the negativity that comes because of the way that they question his authority. They were a bit embarrassed maybe that he wasn't as great a speaker as some of the others who had showed up since. They were ashamed that he was poor and wasn't flashy or quote-unquote special. It seems like they judged who was credible the same way we tend to today. They listened to people who appeared influential and successful, people who were powerful, who could provide letters and recommendation from other influential and powerful people. And I think also they decided to not follow Paul, or they started to call into question his credentials because they didn't really like what he was saying. He started to challenge them. He started to say, these other things don't matter. And if we remember from the other chapter, from the other book, Paul says the only thing that matters is that Jesus died and rose again, and that is how we judge who is a good leader or not. And here again, Paul says that this appearance of being influential or being successful, that's not what matters. As we saw in the last letter, the way we judge leaders is how much they point to Christ and how much they seem to be in it for themselves. Preaching Christ for profit, for example, by asking for lots of money from the communities they served, which these so-called super apostles were doing to the people in Corinth. How much they promoted themselves. These kinds of people, Paul says, spent a lot of time trying to convince others of their value and authority, often by trying to present themselves as better than they really are, and by hiding their flaws. But Paul says this doesn't really give us a true glimpse of the gospel. The story of Jesus isn't about us being or becoming great or successful. The story of Jesus is about freedom, renewal, and forgiveness for those who are trapped, broken, and sinful. So this means that we need to be willing to admit that we are trapped, broken, and sinful people. So the fact that Paul appeared poor, suffering, and unimpressive was not a criticism in his mind, but a commendation. As people who follow Jesus, we don't need to try to live up to the standards which the world puts forward as impressive or successful. We can be the people God has made us and is calling us to be, knowing that through Jesus we have so much more. And this brings us to what I think are the key verses of 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians 4, verses 6 to 9. For God, who said, "Let the light shine out of darkness," has made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. But We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed. We're perplexed, but not in despair. We're persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. And the same is true of you, and can be true for you. Your worldly standing isn't what defines you. Your like count on social media, or how much money you have in your bank account, or how perfect you project your life to be. For if you follow Jesus, the God who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us.